The evening sun cast long shadows across Dubai Marina as Zoha Al-Mahdi stood on her penthouse terrace, designer dress flowing in the desert breeze. 35 years old and worth more than most small nations, she possessed everything a woman could desire. Yet her manicured fingers trembled as she scrolled through vendor confirmations for tomorrow's charity gala. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was organizing an event for underprivileged children while drowning in her own emotional poverty. Behind her, the vast penthouse echoed with the hollow acoustics of a museum, pristine, untouched, and utterly lifeless. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fractals across imported Italian marble, while fresh white roses, changed daily by an army of staff, released their fragrance into air that nobody breathed deeply enough to appreciate. The sliding glass door whispered open without ceremony. Khalid Al-Mahdi stepped onto the terrace without glancing at his wife, his attention permanently anchored to his phone screen. At 42, he possessed the casual arrogance of old money combined with new power, his designer suit impeccably tailored and his presence somehow managing to make the expansive terrace feel smaller. Rima called. "The boy has fever. I'll stay at the compound tonight," he announced, his voice carrying the tone one might use to discuss a mundane business appointment. Zoha's fingers paused over her tablet. 4 years of marriage, and still his casual dismissals cut like surgical blades. The second wife, the fertile one, always took precedence. Rima had given him what Zoha's body refused to provide: sons to carry the Al-Mahdi name forward. Her infertility had transformed her from beloved wife to expensive ornament, beautiful to display but ultimately useless for legacy building. "The charity gala is tomorrow," she said quietly, though she knew he'd already forgotten. Khalid finally looked up, his dark eyes assessing her with clinical interest. "Wear the emerald necklace. It photographs well." With that contribution to their marriage, he disappeared back into the penthouse, leaving Zoha alone with her golden prison. Below, on the compound grounds, she could see the Saeed family's villa through the manicured gardens. Layla Saeed was shepherding her 2 young children inside for dinner, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze as little arms wrapped around her legs. The scene of domestic bliss that Zoha watched nightly from her terrace like a voyeur studying a life she could never possess. Tariq emerged from the villa's entrance, still in his business attire, sweeping his daughter into his arms as his son raced around them in circles. The perfect family tableau that mocked her barren existence with its effortless completeness. The next morning arrived with mechanical precision. Personal trainer at 6, nutritionist at 7, stylist by 8. A carefully orchestrated routine that masked despair beneath structure. Zoha had learned that schedules could substitute for purpose, at least temporarily. Her morning jog through the residential compound was less about fitness than escape. 30 minutes when thoughts could drift beyond charity committees and social obligations. The manicured pathways wound between Mediterranean-style villas, each worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. It was here, among perfectly trimmed hedges and imported fountains, that fate adjusted its cosmic calculations. The collision occurred at the artificial lake's corner. Strong hands caught her shoulders as she stumbled backward, and suddenly she was staring into warm brown eyes that actually seemed to see her. The man was tall, athletic with natural confidence, salt and pepper stubble suggesting discipline rather than vanity. Most remarkably, he was smiling. Not the practiced social expression she knew intimately, but something genuine. "Tariq Saeed," he said simply, extending his hand. "Zoha Al-Mahdi." His handshake lasted longer than propriety demanded. She felt something forgotten stirring in her chest, the flutter of possibility. This was her neighbor, the man whose perfect family life she'd observed from her terrace with a mixture of longing and bitter envy. "Villa 7 with my wife Layla and our 2 children," he mentioned casually. "I've noticed the jasmine plants on your terrace from our garden below. Someone waters them every morning at exactly 7:15. The observation was intimate in a way that made her breath catch. When had anyone last noticed her routines, her small attempts to nurture life in her sterile environment? She'd watched his family countless evenings, Layla's effortless motherhood, the children's uninhibited joy, everything Zoha's barren body could never provide Khalid. Yet something flickered in Tariq's expression that suggested the domestic bliss she envied wasn't as complete as it appeared from her elevated perspective. They stood in morning sunlight, two beautiful people trapped in glittering lives that rotted beneath the surface. In his carefully guarded expression, Zoha recognized something familiar and dangerous, a loneliness that matched her own, a hunger that wealth couldn't satisfy, the realization that the perfect neighbor husband was as starved for genuine connection as she was sent electricity through her nerve endings. Neither moved to continue their respective jogs. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken recognition and the dangerous knowledge that they were near neighbors playing with fire. "Perhaps we'll run into each other again," Tariq said finally. "Perhaps we will," Zoha replied, though both knew with absolute certainty their next encounter would be anything but accidental. As he disappeared around the corner toward Villa 7 where his complete family waited, Zoha touched her shoulder where his hands had rested. For the first time in months, she felt something other than numbness. It was dangerous and foolish and completely inappropriate for a woman in her position, especially with her neighbor's husband, the man whose perfect family she'd envied from afar. It was also the most alive she'd felt since discovering that marriage could be just another type of beautiful, suffocating cage. The jasmine plants on her terrace suddenly seemed worth watering with more care. After all, even in the most gilded of prisons, something might still bloom. And now she knew exactly who was watching her tend them each morning from the garden below. The coffee at the private club in DIFC grew cold between them as 3 weeks of carefully orchestrated encounters had evolved into this. Lunch meetings disguised as business discussions, though neither had any business to discuss. Tariq's wedding ring caught the afternoon light as he reached for his untouched cup, the gold band mocking them both with its reminder of boundaries they were systematically dismantling. They weren't discussing hotels or charity events anymore. Through careful omissions and meaningful silences, they were confessing the slow death of their marriages. Tariq's wife had become absorbed in children's activities, treating him like a reliable provider rather than a man. Zoha's husband treated her like expensive artwork, beautiful to display, forgotten when guests departed. The shared recognition of their invisible status within their own homes created an intimacy more dangerous than physical attraction. They were two people drowning in their respective lives, reaching for each other across the wreckage of their marriages with the desperation of those who had found their only source of oxygen. That evening, Zoha stood in her private art studio, a converted spare bedroom that Khaled had never bothered to enter. Canvases lined the walls, explosions of color and emotion she'd never shown another soul. When Tariq's message asking about her day arrived, for the first time in years someone actually wanted to know. She photographed one painting, a woman's silhouette against a desert sunset, and sent it without explanation. The next week, she invited him to see the studio. Tariq moved among her canvases with genuine reverence, studying each piece as if decoding her soul. His appreciation was intoxicating after years of Khaled's dismissive attitude toward her little hobby. When he stopped before her most raw piece, swirls of gold and crimson capturing her internal storm, and recognized its emotional truth, something shifted irrevocably between them. Standing inches apart, the space crackled with months of suppressed desire and emotional connection. When his hand rose to touch her cheek, she leaned into the caress like a flower turning toward sunlight. The kiss that followed was inevitable as gravity, soft at first, then desperate, as if they were drowning and had found their only source of air. Years of emotional starvation poured into that moment. The affair that followed was orchestrated with military precision. Encrypted messaging apps appeared on their phones under innocuous names. Business meetings provided cover for hotel encounters in towers far from their social circles. They became masters of deception, crafting elaborate alibis their spouses accepted without question. Ironically, the secret relationship transformed them both. Zoha glowed with newfound confidence that made her more beautiful than expensive treatments ever had. Tariq carried himself with renewed energy his wife attributed to business success. They were radiant with shared purpose, alive in ways their marriages had never allowed. For Zoha, it was her first taste of genuine happiness in years. Someone wanted her thoughts, valued her opinions, craved her presence. Tariq listened when she spoke about art, dreams, fears buried beneath social obligations. He made her feel essential rather than ornamental. Tariq found himself addicted to feeling truly alive. With Zoha, conversations had depth beyond logistics and appearances. She challenged his thinking, appreciated his ambitions, made him remember who he'd been before marriage domesticated his spirit. They filled voids in each other they hadn't realized existed. But paradise, even stolen, comes with hidden costs. Zoha began checking Tariq's phone when he showered, memorizing his schedule with obsessive precision. She questioned gaps in his availability, needed constant reassurance of his devotion. The confidence he'd restored revealed an underlying neediness that had always existed, merely dormant. Casual inquiries about his whereabouts became interrogations delivered with practiced nonchalance that fooled neither of them. Where had he been during unaccounted hours? Why hadn't he responded to her message immediately? The independence that had originally enchanted him was morphing into possession. Tariq felt the first stirrings of unease. The woman who'd captivated him with her autonomy was becoming clingy in ways that reminded him uncomfortably of everything he was trying to escape. Her love, which had felt like liberation, began resembling another cage. More beautiful than his marriage, but confining nonetheless. Yet neither could stop. They were addicted now to the passion, to feeling wanted, to the intoxicating belief that they'd found their soulmates. The guilt gnawed at Tariq during family dinners, but evaporated the moment Zoha smiled at him across a hotel room. They told themselves they'd found true love, that their marriages had been mistakes, that fate had finally corrected its error. The dangerous dance continued, each encounter deepening their emotional dependence, while revealing the fault lines that would eventually destroy them both. In their desperation to feel alive, they were slowly killing everything they claimed to cherish about each other. The private desert picnic was Zoha's masterpiece of orchestration. Persian rugs spread across pristine sand, crystal champagne flutes catching the golden hour light, and a feast prepared by Dubai's most exclusive caterer. They sat 2 hours from the city in complete isolation, surrounded by endless dunes that stretched toward a horizon painted in amber and rose. To any observer, it might have appeared romantic. To Tariq, it felt increasingly like entrapment. Zoha had been building toward this moment for weeks, her conversations circling closer to dangerous territory with each encounter. She spoke constantly of their future together, painting elaborate fantasies of the life they could share without the burden of pretense. Her obsession had evolved from charming devotion to something darker, more consuming. "Look at what we could have," she said, gesturing to the elaborate spread around them. "No hiding, no lies, no stolen hours. Just us, completely free." The desert wind carried her words away, but their weight remained. Tariq watched her face transform as she outlined her vision. Leaving their respective spouses, combining their wealth, creating a life of absolute honesty. She had calculated every detail with the precision she once applied to charity galas. Except now the event she was planning was the destruction of their marriages. "I can offer you everything Layla can't," Zoha continued, her voice gaining intensity. "Financial freedom, complete devotion, no distractions." Her hand moved to her flat stomach with unconscious gesture. "No competing obligations. I'm entirely yours." The implicit reference to her infertility hung between them like a weapon disguised as gift. What she couldn't give him in children like Layla had, she would compensate for with total availability. It was a transaction dressed as romance, and Tariq felt the first chill of recognition at what she was truly offering. Not partnership, but ownership. Her eyes held a fevered brightness that had been growing stronger with each passing week. The confident woman who had first attracted him was disappearing, replaced by someone whose sense of self seemed entirely dependent on his presence. When he remained silent, her composure began to crack. "You love me," she pressed, no longer asking but stating as fact. "You've said so. People who love each other don't live lies." The ultimatum crystallized between them without being explicitly voiced. Choose her completely, or lose her entirely. But Tariq was beginning to understand that choosing her completely might mean losing himself in ways he hadn't anticipated. The boundaries that had once seemed negotiable became Zoha's next targets. She began appearing at his office without warning, gliding past security with the entitled confidence of the wealthy. Her visits grew more frequent and less discreet, colleagues noting the beautiful woman who seemed to have unlimited access to their boss's schedule. "Mrs. Al-Mahdi is here to see you," his assistant would announce, and Tariq would feel his stomach drop. The professional sanctuary he'd tried to maintain was being systematically invaded. Zoha would arrive with elaborate justifications, discussing potential collaborations, seeking his expertise on hotel ventures that existed only in her imagination. During one particularly brazen visit, she cornered him in his office while his team waited in the conference room for an important presentation. Her hands roamed his chest as she whispered about missing him, seemingly oblivious to the glass walls that offered little privacy. "I needed to see you," she murmured. "It's been 3 days. Zoha, we can't do this here," he said, gently removing her hands while glancing toward the conference room where faces were beginning to turn. "Then where? When? I feel like I'm disappearing when we're apart." The desperation in her voice was becoming a constant undertone, threading through their every interaction. What had once felt like passionate devotion now carried the sharp edge of hysteria. His phone rang at that moment, Layla's name appearing on the screen, and Zoha's expression darkened with unmistakable jealousy. At home in Villa 7, the changes in Tariq hadn't gone unnoticed. His wife, Layla, observed him with growing puzzlement over dinner conversations that had grown stilted and strange. He was physically present but emotionally elsewhere, his phone commanding more attention than his family's daily updates. "You seem different lately," Layla mentioned one evening, her tone carefully neutral. Distracted. Their children, sensitive to adult tensions they couldn't name, had grown quieter around the dinner table. The family dynamic was shifting in ways that made everyone uncomfortable but no one could identify. Tariq's guilt manifested as overcompensation. Expensive gifts for the children, elaborate weekend plans, anything to assuage the growing certainty that he was destroying everything he'd once valued. The irony wasn't lost on him that his affair with their upstairs neighbor had made him more attentive to his family's needs, even as it prepared to annihilate their foundation entirely. Layla's increased efforts to reconnect only amplified his guilt, creating a vicious cycle where her attention made him withdraw further, which prompted more attempts at intimacy he couldn't reciprocate. Zoha's paranoia intensified as she sensed his growing distance. From her penthouse above, she could see into their villa's windows, watching his family interactions with the obsessive focus of a surveillance expert. She interrogated him about every moment they spent apart, demanded explanations for delayed responses to her messages, created elaborate tests of his devotion that grew increasingly impossible to satisfy. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday evening when Zoha summoned him to her penthouse with an urgent message claiming emergency. He found her pacing the marble floors, her designer dress wrinkled, her usually perfect hair disheveled. The controlled perfection she'd always maintained was finally cracking under the pressure of her obsession. "I can't continue like this," she announced before he'd fully entered the room. "Living in pieces, stealing moments, pretending we're something casual when we both know we're everything to each other." Tariq closed the door behind him, recognizing the trap that had been carefully constructed around this moment. The penthouse felt smaller somehow, the luxury oppressive rather than impressive. "Zoha, we've discussed this." "No, you've avoided this," she interrupted, her voice rising. "You've hidden behind excuses and obligations while I've given you everything I have to give." The argument that followed was brutal in its honesty. Months of suppressed tensions erupted as Zoha demanded he choose definitively between his life and their future. She wept, she raged, she pleaded with the desperate fervor of someone whose entire identity had become wrapped around another person's love. When words failed, she resorted to darker manipulation. Threats of self-harm delivered through tears, emotional blackmail disguised as vulnerability, promises that she would disappear from his life if only he would admit he didn't love her enough to commit completely. Tariq found himself crying too, recognizing that the woman he'd fallen in love with was disappearing beneath layers of obsession and need. He saw clearly for the first time how their affair had transformed from liberation into another form of imprisonment. More beautiful than his marriage, but no less confining. "I can't leave my family," he said finally, the words falling like stones into water. "I won't." The silence that followed was more terrifying than her hysteria had been. Zoha's face went through a transformation that chilled him, from desperate pleading to something cold and calculating. The tears stopped as if a switch had been flipped, replaced by an unnatural calm that suggested internal mechanisms beyond reason. "I see," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality he'd never heard before. "I understand completely now." It was the moment Tariq realized their dangerous dance had crossed into territory from which there might be no return. The woman standing before him was no longer the passionate lover or even the obsessed mistress. She was something else entirely, something that accepted his rejection with the terrifying composure of someone who had already begun planning their next move. The private investigator's report arrived in a manila envelope that Zoha studied with the intensity of a military strategist examining battlefield maps. Photographs of Tariq's daily routines, his children's school schedules, Layla's shopping patterns, every detail of the family life she could observe from her penthouse reduced to surveillance data. What had begun as curiosity had metastasized into something far more sinister. She followed him herself now, her luxury sedan maintaining careful distance as he moved through predictable patterns. The gym at dawn, the office by 8, lunch meetings that no longer included her. Watching him exist without her felt like witnessing her own erasure, each mundane moment of his independence confirming her growing irrelevance in his carefully compartmentalized world. The rational woman who had once organized charity galas with military precision was disappearing, replaced by someone who spray-painted accusations on his office building's parking garage wall in elegant Arabic script. Someone who sent anonymous letters to his business partners hinting at improprieties. Someone who called Villa 7 at midnight, hanging up when Layla answered but ensuring the disruption rippled through their peaceful domestic routine. Her behavior escalated with each ignored message, each attempt to re-establish contact that met with silence. The ultimatum she'd delivered in the desert had been met with the cruelest response possible: complete avoidance. He was erasing her from his life as if their months together had been nothing more than an unpleasant business transaction requiring closure. From her penthouse terrace, she watched Layla tend their garden in the early mornings, the same garden where Tariq had first noticed her jasmine plants. The irony was exquisite. She had become the observer of the life she tried to destroy, relegated to watching her former lover play the devoted father and husband mere floors below her surveillance. The encounter at the Emirates Mall was unplanned, a collision of circumstance that caught both women off guard. Zoha was trailing Layla through the luxury corridors when her neighbor turned abruptly, their eyes meeting with the shock of recognition. Layla's face held no anger, only a profound sadness that was somehow worse than rage would have been. "You're her?" Layla said quietly, stopping near the fountain where families gathered to throw coins and make wishes. "The woman from upstairs. The one my husband has been seeing." The direct confrontation stripped away all pretense. Here was the neighbor whose existence Zoha had tried to minimize, whose marriage she'd been systematically destroying from the penthouse above their villa. This wasn't the negligent spouse of her imagination, but a woman worn down by her husband's inexplicable distance and the mysterious presence watching from the terrace overhead. "I know about the affair," Layla continued when Zoha remained silent. "I've known for weeks. I see you watching us from your terrace. I just wanted to see what kind of woman could make a man abandon his children for someone living right above them." The word children hit like a physical blow. In all her obsessive planning for their future together, Zoha had reduced Tariq's family to abstract obstacles rather than human beings who would be devastated by her desires. Standing before his wife, her downstairs neighbor, she faced the collateral damage of her love with crystal clarity. Yet even presented with this opportunity for redemption, Zoha chose denial over confession. She walked away without speaking, leaving Layla standing by the fountain with tears she was too proud to shed publicly. The moment passed, and with it, her last chance to end the destruction before it consumed them all. Alone in her penthouse that night, Zoha mixed prescription anxiety medication with vintage wine, the chemical combination creating a dangerous clarity that felt like revelation. Her internal monologue had taken on a new quality, logical and terrifying in its progression. If Tariq truly loved her, he would choose her regardless of consequences. If he didn't choose her, then perhaps the choice needed to be removed from his hands entirely. The internet searches began innocuously, articles about crimes of passion, methods that left minimal evidence, famous cases where love had justified extreme actions. She researched with the same thoroughness she'd once applied to venue selection and catering menus, accumulating knowledge she told herself she would never use. "If I can't have him, no one can," became her mantra, repeated until it transformed from desperate thought to reasonable conclusion. The woman who had once prided herself on selfless devotion was revealing the possessive core that had always lurked beneath. Her love had never been about Tariq's happiness. It had been about her own validation, her need to be chosen above all others. The confrontation in the parking garage was her final gambit, orchestrated with the precision of someone who had studied his patterns obsessively. She waited by his car in the shadows of the business district, emerging as he approached with keys in hand. The underground space provided privacy for what she intended to be their ultimate conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," she announced, her voice carrying false calm. "You're right. We should leave our spouses and start fresh." When he refused again, gently but definitively, something fundamental broke inside her. The word obsession left his lips like a diagnosis, and she heard it as the final verdict on everything she'd believed about their connection. His rejection was complete and irreversible. As she watched him drive away, leaving her alone in the fluorescent-lit garage, the last vestiges of the woman she'd been disappeared entirely. What remained was pure need, stripped of conscience or consequence. The invitation she sent the following evening was masterfully crafted. A message claiming acceptance of his decision and requesting one final meeting to return personal items and achieve closure. Her tone was measured, almost businesslike, suggesting she had finally achieved the rationality he'd been hoping for. Tariq arrived at her penthouse to find an elaborate dinner prepared, candles flickering against imported crystal. The apartment transformed into something resembling their early encounters. Zoha greeted him with unnatural serenity, moving through the preparations with the methodical precision of someone following a carefully rehearsed script. He couldn't know that she had already decided this would be their last meal together. The dinner progressed with surreal normalcy, crystal glasses clinking softly as Zoha poured vintage wine with steady hands. Tariq sat across from her at the marble dining table, his posture tense despite her seemingly rational demeanor. The candles cast dancing shadows across her face, revealing glimpses of the obsession lurking beneath her composed mask. "I've accepted your decision," she said, her voice carrying an unnatural calm that should have terrified him. "I wanted one last evening together to say goodbye properly." Tariq relaxed slightly, mistaking her serenity for genuine acceptance. They spoke of trivial things, the weather, upcoming charity events, anything but the wreckage of their affair. Yet beneath her practiced conversation, Zoha's mind was calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to make her final plea. When the main course was cleared, she moved closer, her eyes brightening with renewed hope. "I know you said it's over, but what if we could start fresh? What if I told Khalid everything and you explained to Layla that we're meant to be together?" The fantasy spilled from her lips with desperate intensity. They could live openly, travel the world, create the life they dreamed of during their stolen hours. She painted the picture with the same precision she'd once applied to charity galas, every detail meticulously planned. Tariq's gentle refusal shattered her carefully constructed composure. "Zoha, we've discussed this. I'm going home to my family. This has to end." The word family triggered something primal and dangerous. Her face transformed, all pretense of acceptance crumbling as months of suppressed rage erupted. She lunged across the table, her manicured nails clawing at his face as coherent pleas dissolved into animalistic desperation. "You can't leave me," she screamed, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "I won't let you go back to her." The struggle was brief but brutal. Tariq tried to restrain her without causing harm, but Zoha's desperation gave her unexpected strength. When he managed to break free and move toward the door, she grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the sideboard. The first blow caught him across the temple. He staggered, blood streaming down his face as shock registered in his eyes. The second strike was deliberate, calculated, driven by a possessive fury that had consumed every rational thought. The third was unnecessary, but she couldn't stop herself. Silence fell like a curtain across the penthouse. Tariq lay motionless on the imported marble, his blood creating abstract patterns across the pristine surface. Zoha stood over him, the crystal decanter still clutched in her trembling hands, reality crashing down with devastating force. What had she done? The man she claimed to love beyond reason lay dead at her feet, destroyed by the very obsession that was supposed to prove her devotion. Panic and survival instincts warred with grief as the magnitude of her actions began to sink in. The next hours passed in a blur of methodical activity. Zoha's event planning skills served her well as she transformed the crime scene into an elaborate fiction. She staged a robbery, scattering jewelry and electronics, breaking the terrace door to suggest forced entry. Every message between them was deleted, every photo destroyed, every trace of their affair methodically erased. When she called the police, her voice shook with genuine trauma. The grieving neighbor who had discovered her friend's body after hearing suspicious noises from upstairs. The wealthy socialite who couldn't possibly be involved in something so sordid. But digital footprints are harder to erase than physical evidence. The investigation that followed systematically unraveled her carefully constructed lie. Security cameras captured her car leaving the building at times that contradicted her statement. Deleted messages were recovered from cloud backups. Financial records revealed the private investigator, the hotel receipts, the elaborate deceptions. Detective Sarah Al-Mansouri, no relation to Zoha's family, approached the case with the methodical precision of someone who had seen wealth attempt to buy innocence before. The timeline inconsistencies emerged quickly. Zoha claimed to have been shopping when surveillance footage showed her car in the building's garage. The staged robbery scene looked exactly like what it was, a desperate attempt at misdirection. The affair's exposure sent shockwaves through Dubai's elite society. Layla Saeed, devastated by her husband's betrayal and violent death, faced the additional horror of learning her neighbor had been systematically destroying her marriage from the penthouse above. The compound's residents whispered about the beautiful killer who had watched them all from her terrace like a predator selecting prey. Zoha's arrest came 3 weeks after the murder, executed with the quiet efficiency that protected the reputations of all involved. She broke down completely when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the composed mask finally cracking to reveal the shattered woman beneath. The media coverage was swift and merciless. Dubai's perfect socialite revealed as an obsessed murderer, her charity work and social standing reduced to footnotes in a sordid tale of passion and violence. The trial that followed was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive clear, the defendant's guilt undeniable. Zoha's expensive lawyers managed to avoid the death penalty, securing a life sentence that would be served in conditions far removed from her former luxury. In her prison cell, stripped of designer clothing and surrounded by concrete walls instead of marble, Zoha finally understood the true cost of her obsession. She had destroyed everything she claimed to love. Tariq's life, his family's peace, her own existence. The love she thought justified any action had revealed itself as possession, pure and devastating. Layla Saeed moved away from the compound with her children, unable to bear living beneath the penthouse where her husband's killer had watched their family with predatory intensity. The Villa 7 garden, where Tariq had first noticed Zoha's jasmine plants, grew wild without care. The penthouse was sold for far below market value, its marble floors professionally cleaned but forever stained with the memory of violence. Life moved on without Zoha, the social events she'd once organized continuing with barely a pause to acknowledge her absence. In the end, her obsession had accomplished the exact opposite of what she'd intended. Instead of binding Tariq to her forever, she had destroyed him completely. Instead of proving her love's superiority, she had revealed its toxic, destructive nature. The golden cage she tried to escape had been replaced by one of concrete and steel, where she would spend the rest of her days contemplating the ruins of everything she'd once held dear.